Good day to all, and thank you for joining our launch of the little book of investing in nature in connection with the One Planet Summit in Paris. This event, which will keep us together for the coming hour and a half with exciting topics and intervention on biodiversity finance and new updates with global figures. And its title is nothing less than Financing Life on Earth. It is a discussion with some of the lead authors of the book and other experts on biodiversity finance. Before we start, a few words of thanks to the funders of the little book of biodiversity of investing in nature, or the LBIN as we call it. Thank you to the Corner Atkinson Center for Sustainability, to Credit Suisse, to the Sustainable Trade Initiative, to Mirova, to Biofin of Undp, to WWF, to AFD, the French Development Agency. They all supported this publication and the work to prepare it. And a big thank as well, obviously, to the coordinators and initiators, Andrew Mitchell and Professor John Tobin, with us today for our greatest pleasure. Some few housekeeping rules before we go on. Most of you are familiar with Livestorm. If you have any suggestions, ideas, please share them in the chat tab on the right. If you have questions, do raise them through the question tab, and please note, any one of you can vote for the questions that you like. This will help us to select the questions that you find more interesting and pass them on to the moderators. We will also have one question to you in the poll sondage tab, also on your right. Do check that in time. And I inform you that the meeting will be recorded for the purpose of note-taking and for sharing it beyond the participants today. So again, welcome to all. We are actually so many today to have joined this conference, almost 500, and almost 1,300 have actually registered. So let me now introduce our first speaker, and a very warm welcome to Rémi Rioux, the CEO of the French Development Bank, AFD, who has been a great friend and actor of climate finance before and during the Paris Agreement and since then, and who is now really blossoming as a great voice for biodiversity finance, especially among the community of public development banks. Please, Rémi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gilles, and hello everybody. It's a great pleasure. It's an honor to be with you and welcome you to this discussion on the new edition of the Little Book of Investing in Nature. I participated on Monday at the One Planet Summit at Élysée, dedicated to biodiversity challenges, and the new handbook just arrived during lunch, and so I had the chance and the opportunity to explain its content, the conclusions, the proposals to President Macron, President Gazaoui of Mauritania, President Christine Lagarde from ECB, and other excellencies that were present in Paris before the summit itself, where the discussion on biodiversity finance, as probably you noticed, was presented. Boris Johnson was there, many others taking commitments behind this fight of the century, as President Macron said. Of course, I presented it, but it was on behalf of many partners as a very strong collective effort, and I really would like to thank today all those who have supported and contributed to this journey. A journey, yes, because the Little Pink Book was, first published 10 years ago at COP10, and the new edition relies also on all the experience, the substance that so many partners have accumulated for 10 years on this issue, all rallying behind the global canopy in this indispensable awareness-raising effort. And now we have quite a large circle of stakeholders. Of course, I commend the role of Professor John Tobin de la Puente from Cornell University, Marisa Drew, the Chief Sustainability Officer and Global Head Sustainability Strategy of Credit Suisse, Daniela Torres from Undp Biofin, lead expert for Mexico, Fiona Stewart from the World Bank Group, Philippe Zaweti, dear Philippe from Mirova, Gilles, all of them will be present today. And I also mention, of course, the crucial role of Andrew Mitchell, the founder and senior advisor of Global Canopy, and the whole IDH team with WWF, and all of you participants today joining. Maybe a few words on the content of the handbook from my perspective. A unique work because, as you know, it's the only estimate of the funding gap for biodiversity. We know, reading the text, that we are at about $150 billion today, and that we need to increase tenfold this amount to be at scale by 2030 to face the challenges of conservation, of course, but also of the transformation of value chains, the way we produce and we consume. And the handbook is not only about estimating the financial needs, which is very important in itself. Remember what we did for COP21 on climate. So it's extremely important to put these figures into the preparation of COP15. But it's way more than that, because the handbook also provides the plan to make it happen and make it possible. 4 elements. The first one is there must be a public signal given to the parties by reorienting public subsidies towards a nature-based solution, carbon sequestering habitats, agroforestry, agroecology, and reducing harmful subsidies. So the money is already there. It's only political will that could help reorient these flows. Then, of course, a lot to do through TNFD and other incentives to increase private investments for nature. The handbook clearly established that 80% of all flows are now public, which is important, but way too much in a way. So these public means have to be to help demultiply and leverage the private sector way more than today. And the third direction is, of course, to turn south, because most of biodiversity finance now happens in OECD countries, And we know that the richness of biodiversity is mostly in developing and emerging countries. And of course, I would plea to change the way public is operating, to leverage the private sector, and to turn south. I will plead today on about the crucial role of public development banks. You know, we organized last November the Finance in Common Summit, gathering for the first time ever the whole family of public development banks, multilateral, regional, national, local, 450 of us, amounting to 10%, 2.3 trillion of total global investments each year. And of course, if these public instruments follow the political guidance and act as connectors, as linking public and private, linking global and local for nature, it will certainly make a difference. A group of public development banks, the IDFC club I'm chairing, took a very strong position on biodiversity at the time of the Finance in Common Summit. There's also a strong paragraph in the joint declaration of all of us that was decided then. And let me conclude by saying, as the CEO of Agence Française de Développement, of AFD, to share with you my conviction that we need to link climate finance and biodiversity finance, and avoid a competition between two targets, two negotiations, two worlds, because we all know in this room that the two challenges are intertwined, and that we will fight climate change with nature-based solutions. This is the reason why on Monday at the One Planet Summit, AFD, on behalf of France, committed that 30% of its climate finance will be positive for nature by 2025. It means doubling our biodiversity finance from 500 million euro today to more than 1 billion 5 years from now. And of course, as I said, we need way more financing, but we hope from AFD to put in the discussion and to provide some sort of reference for other financial actors to pay attention and see how far they can go in increasing their investments for nature and linking, because we know that the momentum, the political force will only increase behind climate to embark biodiversity in this fight. So I stop here. Thank you again to all of you to be here. And AFD, of course, is a French agency, so very important to listen to Ms. Bérangère Abad, the French Secretary of State for Biodiversity, who will tell you now more about my own country, France, commitment to preserving biodiversity. So thanks again to the team for this book. Thanks for this webinar and for the vibrant discussion I'm sure will take place now. And Gilles, if okay for you, I turn to our minister for her introduction. Thanks to you all.
Dear all, first I would like to wish you a happy new year for you and your loved ones, even in these complicated and challenging times for everyone. The COVID-19 pandemic reminds us that human health and well-being, biodiversity loss and climate change are fully intertwined. It is therefore of our utmost responsibility to tackle this planetary environmental emergency in an integrated way and make the transformative change needed, leaving no one behind. The good news is that 2021 will be the opportunity to reach an ambitious agreement at the next Biodiversity COP15 and address the issue of financing the preservation and mainstreaming of biodiversity. The publication of the Little Book of Investing in Nature is therefore timely. It provides us with new insight on the biodiversity funding gap that for the first time takes into account funding dedicated to conservation and funding for biodiversity mainstreaming in all economic sectors. Better yet, it gives us solutions. As you know, biodiversity is very high on the agenda for France. President Macron, who has been fully involved in boosting green and sustainable development and recovery, closed on Monday the first One Planet Summit dedicated to biodiversity. Important commitments were made on resource mobilization to create a movement toward a greener economy and greener finance. Through the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, whose ultimate objective is to trigger a massive redirection of flows towards activities that are favorable to biodiversity. At domestic level, France is already on track to amend its legislation to include biodiversity risk in the mandatory reporting standard for financial institutions. France is also fully committed to reform financial contributions harmful to biodiversity, notably through its involvement in the Paris Collaborative on Green Budgeting, initiated by France, Mexico, and the OECD on the One Planet Summit in 2017. The EU-CERN Congress, to be held in September 2021 in Marseille, will be another great opportunity before COP15 to enhance the private sector's mobilization, and more particularly the financial sector, and to help make 2021 a decisive year for the worldwide protection of biodiversity. We really hope this book will help all stakeholders from governments, banks, and NGOs to drive transformation and support an ambitious post-2020 agreement at COP15. Thank you.
Thank you, Remy. Thank you to our State Secretary for Biodiversity, Bérangère Abba, here in Paris, for your insight and encouraging and supporting words. And thank you again for AFD to virtually host this event 10 years after the first publication of the little book on biodiversity finance in Nagoya. I will now give the floor to Andrew Mitchell, founder and senior advisor at Global Canopy and for the Natural Capital Finance Alliance. I'm so glad really again to share this moment with you 10 years almost exactly after I discovered with great enthusiasm the first edition of the ELBIN in Nagoya in 2010, which was such a hit at the CBD Cup 10. Please, Andrew, do take over. The floor is yours.
Well, Gilles, thank you very much, and thank you to Remy and also to Secretary of State Bérangère Abba for their marvelous opening remarks. We are tackling a big topic today, and I want to send out a great welcome to so many people who have joined from all over the world. People I could see from Africa, from Southeast Asia, Jakarta, and of course from Europe and the United States. So welcome to everyone. This is the 10th anniversary of the first little book, which was colored pink, because it was about proactive investment in natural capital, which in those days was rather a new idea. You may recall all the negotiations going on about red, which was reducing emissions from deforestation and so on, and landscapes. Well, the next thing was to go to pink, which was to look at all the agricultural landscapes beyond the forest, which needed protection as well. Well, a lot's changed in 10 years. We're all now living under lockdown, and it's all caused by a tiny speck of nature that we cannot see. The COVID-19 pandemic has done a lot to explain to the world, to all of us, to governments and to the financial sector, the power of nature to turn our economy upside down and all our lives as well. My hearts go out to all those who are suffering around the world. But this is an example of what happens when we mess with nature. when we don't look after what is underpinning 44 trillion of our global economy. That's almost half of GDP that is dependent on services from nature. And when we degrade nature, when we engage in illegal trade in wildlife, and when we mix it all together with strange food production, we get zoonotic diseases coming out like COVID-19, transferring from animals to humans. This shows that the impact of nature on our economic system is not slow, it's not small. In fact, it's big and hits many sectors, and it can be very fast. It's bigger than anything climate has thrown at us. So what we've got to do is figure out how we change the movement of money. Fundamentally, I mean, I used to start out my life as a zoologist 40 years ago, hugging orangutans and trees. I realized I couldn't save them that way. And now I find myself hugging bankers and asset managers, because unless we change the movement of money fundamentally, we will continue to finance ourselves into extinction. So what we're going to go and look at today, and what this 10th anniversary edition of the little book is looking at a menu of different kinds of mechanisms that can change the movement of money, incentivize investment, case studies of where this is actually working around the world. I kind of call it a hitchhiker's guide to financing life on Earth. So it's a good thing to dip into, particularly this year, when the meeting in Kunming will try and come together, bring the world together, bring all the governments together, 200 of them, to come up with a new sort of Paris-style agreement on nature with targets and dates. And we wish them luck in doing that. But how is it all going to be paid for? That's what we need to get into. And to show you how important all this is, there's a short video that I'm going to show you now that sort of sets up our discussion. So Delphine, would you please play the video now? Well, I think that makes it very clear what we're really talking about. And I want to thank Undp for loaning that video for us, which was first shown at the Green Horizon Summit last year. Well, it's time now for you to do a bit of work. You, the audience. We're going to have a poll, and I want to find out what you're thinking. And these questions that are here are deliberately not that easy. They're not the usual easy kind of questions that you might get in a webinar like this, because we're in a deep dive webinar here. We're getting down to the real detail. I want you now to vote. And if you go to the polls section, look at the top right of your screen, it's got a little red dot on it. And if you go there, you can vote on the 5 questions that you're seeing on your screen. So please do that now. And within 90 seconds, we should have the results. So don't spend too long on it. Go with what your heart tells you and make your choice. So the first is about relying on taxes to favor sustainable diets. It's kind of strange, isn't it, that good food is often more expensive than bad food. Cheap food that may be not good for our health and not good for nature. It's cheap for a reason. It's not prepared as well as high quality food. Should we have lower taxes for good food like organic food or vegan food? What about outlawing the destruction of nature and supply chains? Well, do you know what? It's already happening. This week at the One Planet Summit, the President of the European Commission announced that Europe was going to have a new deforestation regulation, making it harder for imports coming into Europe that are connected to deforestation to get into European into the European supply chain. Subsidies, a huge problem. $1 trillion of subsidies are nature negative. What can we do to change those? We don't want to get rid of them, but realign them to make them nature positive. Mandating reporting on risks by the finance sector. Again, back to the banks, insurers, investors. Shouldn't they be reporting on how they're damaging nature in the same way that they now have to report on how they're damaging our climate and atmosphere? That's coming too. And the fifth one, the last one, what about banning international finance for unsustainable intensive agriculture? Not sure how we'd do it, but would it be, in other words, starving the bad businesses of money? And then how do you define what's good or bad? So I don't know, Delphine, if we are ready, if we've got our 90 seconds up, a few more seconds for everyone to think. And then Delphine, when you're ready, you can put up the poll results. So Delphine, can you put up the results? It should come in under the polls section, I think. Well, I don't see the results there yet, and rather than wait, I think we might move on, and they will come shortly. And when they're ready, we might see a little red dot up there, and we can go back to the polls and see if it's there. So I think we're going to press on as time is quite short. So what we're now going to turn to is a description of what's in the book. And to do this, the lead editor for the book, Professor John Tobin at Cornell University, who's been working diligently with me over the last 18 months with many different authors and a steering committee, and in particular, a wonderful team of his at Cornell University. And a shout out for Al and Al Majid, who also did so much work on this, if they're listening. So John, you have the floor. Tell us what's in the book.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you all to attending this presentation. I just want to make sure that we have the slides up as well. And I think we are awaiting those, but they should be in front of us shortly. Voila. Okay, thank you. Excellent. Well, summarizing 1.5 years of work into 10 minutes, as you can imagine, is a bit of a challenge, but let me just try to touch on some of the highlights of the book, where we're coming from and where we think we may be heading from here, and ideally whet your appetite and make you want to download the book and take a more careful look at it. So how did we approach this in the first place? We started by asking a very simple question. How much are we spending today on nature? And if we decided as a community of nations that we want to maintain biodiversity sustainably managed for the long term, how much should we be spending in order to accomplish that? Once we have figured that out, the immediate natural next question is, how do we close the biodiversity finance gap? If there is a delta, if there is indeed a difference between what we spend and what we need to be spending to protect nature, what are the solutions and the mechanisms that we can apply to close that? And then third and finally, how can public capital and private capital collaborate, work together, side by side to help preserve biodiversity? The reality is, and I may be jumping ahead a little bit here, but governmental budgets and philanthropic organizations will simply not be enough to close the biodiversity financing gap. So making private return-seeking capital a part of the solution to the biodiversity crisis, rather than being part of the problem, which unfortunately much of finance has been up until now, will be difficult and will require more effort and more focus than many recognize. But the potential impacts are huge. Now, in terms of how we organize some of the information, we applied the UNDP Biofin framework. It's a 4-part framework that many of you, particularly those of you who have worked on national finance plans, national biodiversity finance plans, will be quite familiar with. And it consists of 4 pillars: the generation of revenue, the delivery of that revenue once it has been generated, the realignment of expenditures. So for existing capital, how can it be spent in a manner that is more nature positive? And finally, crucially, one part that doesn't get a lot of attention is how do we avoid future costs or foregone revenues that we could be earning in the future if we make certain interventions today that prevent having to incur those costs in the future. Now, we have slightly modified this UNDP Biofin framework with an additional element which we consider critical, especially given the moment, and that is catalysts. And catalysts are crucially important because the crisis is real and it is immediate and there is no time to waste. If we allowed the sustainable finance ecosystem, if you will, the natural capital system to develop organically from within, it will eventually develop. The question is, will it develop in time to prevent massive loss of biodiversity? And the answer is probably not. So in order to facilitate the application of these 4 different categories of mechanisms or solutions, catalysts that facilitate them will be crucially important. More on that in the book. In terms of the current scale of finance, I should mention that, long story short, a lot of work, much of it done in collaboration with our friends at the Nature Conservancy, with some involvement of the Paulson Institute as well, and building on the shoulders of giants, really. OECD, for example, has done tremendous work in this space. National Geographic, more recently, has done some great work. And the estimate that we can have come up with for spending on nature is in the order of $124 to $143 billion per year, which is a lot of money. But how does that compare to biodiversity financing needs? And the reality is that it is very different. We should be, if we want to manage biodiversity for the long term, somewhere in the order of $720 to $960 billion per year. So that delta, that difference, is this biodiversity finance gap that needs to be closed. How do we close it? How do we close that gap? I want to draw attention to a crucially important fact, which has already been highlighted in the poll, and that is negative subsidies are a real problem for nature. And I want to emphasize that it's not subsidies themselves, because subsidies by nature or by definition are neither positive nor negative for nature. It all depends on how they are implemented. And the fact is, many of our subsidies policies, which national governments implement, and in many cases for very understandable political or cultural or social reasons, have been designed to achieve just that, to support groups in need, but not necessarily to support biodiversity. And it is the shift to a different way of implementing subsidies, which will be crucial because, as you see in this graph, even under the most optimistic growth assumptions of the most important mechanisms or the most promising mechanisms for raising capital, and that is the middle column. If you look at the teal colored rectangles, that will still not be enough to get us to a break-even point unless we reduce subsidies. However, if we do reduce subsidies, and again, biodiversity negative subsidies to be clear, then we can actually not only break even, but do very well. We cover in the order of 40 mechanisms or solutions in some detail in the book, and I invite you to go read them yourselves. All of them aligned with the Biofin framework, and we have a number of case studies that illustrate the challenges and the points that you should keep in mind when implementing those solutions. None of them easy, but some of them very, very effective. I'll just mention by way of example a couple in the area of generation. Green bonds, a form of financing that almost everyone on this call will be familiar with. But you will also know that most green bonds out there have been designed in a manner or pitched to investors in a manner that is clear that the use of proceeds is for energy efficiency projects, green buildings, public transportation. Relatively few are addressing nature conservation directly. But one great example is the Green Republic of France bond of 2017, started at 7.6 billion and has grown from there. Another example, realignment of harmful subsidies. And I mentioned in passing here the fact that the Kyrgyzstan government, working with Undp Biofin, has already gone quite some way towards reforming their own ag subsidies in order to reduce agrochemicals that can be harmful to biodiversity and excessive water use. The next one I should mention is the example of private protected areas as an example of delivering existing capital better. Private protected areas may serve a tremendously helpful functioning in complementing what has been done by governments and establishing additional protected areas that would not be there but for the efforts of private parties. Finally, I'd like to mention environmental impact bonds, which are a new form of instrument that it has huge promise. There are some difficulties, but systems in which the political realities do not allow the implementation of novel solutions to biodiversity conservation can greatly benefit from risk capital that is willing to come into the transaction on a conditional basis, subject to the outcomes of the novel solutions or interventions that are being proposed. There are some great examples out there that are now in pilot phase or some fully launched. For the Forest Resilience Bond of Blue Forest Conservation is one example. There are the urban water bonds of Quantified Ventures and others that you may be aware of are in development. Finally, and to wrap up, I would like to draw attention to a fact that we view as crucial to developing conservation and biodiversity financing with the support of an active participation of private capital as a solution. And that is, individual solutions, individual transactions, individual initiatives amount to exactly that. Helpful pilots that illustrate the viability or not of a particular kind of transaction or initiative or project or arrangement, but they tend to pop up. Some are successful, some are not, and then they disappear. But if you think of this new space that we're moving into, biodiversity finance, as a newly colonized island, to take the ecosystem analogy one step further, the individual arrival of a bird or a few seeds of a plant is not enough. For a living, breathing ecosystem to develop on that new island, there needs to be a simultaneous coexistence of any number of different species that have different roles in ecological parlance that fill different niches within that ecosystem. And in the case of a financial ecosystem for nature, we need to have, as we have seen develop in other systems, all of those support and service providers and the banks and the useful and sort of more conducive regulatory framework that supports the development of this field. In other words, it's not through individual efforts that we're going to make a difference, at least not a difference quickly. Given the urgency of the situation, we need to do this in a coordinated manner. And that's why a catalyst, such as government support of the development of this financial ecosystem, is crucial. On the right of that slide in front of you, you will see some of the transformations that will be needed and in order to develop that ecosystem. And with that, I will go back to Andrew, and there's certainly no time for Q&A, but I believe we'll be addressing some questions later.
Well, thank you very much, John, for a very interesting run-through of the contents of this book. It's a rich guide, so you need to know where to find it. And one place you can find this book is you go to the website of Global Canopy. Just type in to your search engine globalcanopy.org, and there it is on the front page, Little Book of Investing in Nature. You can find it there, and maybe someone listening can put that into the chat, that web where you can find the book. So many thanks, John. A difficult job going through so many wonderful pieces of work that went into compiling that book. I thought you'd like to know the results of the poll. If you've had a look at the chat, they're in the chat. If you scroll down to Agence Française, you will find it a few pages down. But actually, the results are pretty interesting. First of all, the first and winner and the most popular thing was to rearrange subsidies to be nature positive rather than nature negative. That at 33% was way out in front as being the most important thing. Second in that came with banning finance for intensive agriculture. Well, that'll be pretty radical, wouldn't it? After that comes the supply chains, dealing with supply chains that are nature negative. That's, of course, allied to intensive agriculture. 18% of you thought that was the most important thing. And then fourth and fifth, which are pretty close to each other, was reporting by the financial sector on its impacts on nature, and also realigning taxes to favor sustainable foods. So very interesting results. Maybe it's worth putting them up again in the chat as we've just highlighted it for those who didn't see it earlier. But thank you so much for taking part in that. We're now going to go on to the panel section of our event. And I'm going to introduce the very, very exciting and interesting panel that we've got for you. So panelists, would you like to please join? Here they are. If you'd like to join the screen whilst I'm talking. Over there on the left is Daniela Torres. Daniela is currently working at Undp, the United Nations Development Programme, as lead expert on biodiversity finance initiative in Mexico. But prior to that, she was working with Mexico's central bank. So we're going to ask Daniela to tell us a bit what a bank regulator can do, because they are, after all, the high priests of the financial system, creating the rules that makes money move around the world. Marissa Drew is Chief Sustainability Officer at Credit Suisse, a bank in Switzerland. And Credit Suisse has done a tremendous amount of work in this area through the every January, they have a regular conference on conservation finance, bringing the experts of the world together, usually in New York. But this year it's going to be virtual next week. And Melissa is also involved in the strategy and ambition for Credit Suisse and for creating and facilitating sustainable investments on behalf of the bank's wealth management, institutional and corporate clients. Next, we have Fiona Stewart, who's global lead on insurance and pensions at the World Bank Group. And she's a lead financial sector specialist, is part of the long-term finance team at the World Bank's Finance Competitiveness and Innovation Global Practice. And she's worked a lot on sustainability issues. And then finally, we have Philippe Zawati, who's the CEO of Mirova. Philippe is managing director of Mirova, which is an asset management company specializing in sustainable investment. And he created this with Natixis at 2014. But Philippe has been a leading light in Paris in the biodiversity and finance movement. And we're extremely lucky to have him and all the other panelists to talk to us today. So welcome to you all. Let me just outline a few things that I want us to get into on this in this moment that we have in front of us. We talk about creating a financial ecosystem for nature. In climate, it's taken 15 years, but there is already an emerging kind of ecosystem. One of the big advantages of the climate debate is it has a target. This was decided in Paris. It's 1.5 degrees. It also has a currency. It's called 1 ton of carbon. The problem with nature is we don't have these. We don't have a unit of nature that we can trade like a ton of carbon, nor do we have targets. We hope they might come out in the COP15 in China later this year. We need a kind of Paris agreement for nature. So there are big gaps there. We don't have good laws and regulations around nature as well, or if they are there, they're not always implemented. In many countries, there are laws, but they're not always implemented for nature. We have problems in that money, which is flowing, the impact on nature is invisible. If you look inside a Bloomberg terminal, which is the way in which many transactions, at least in the Western world, are done, a huge amount of money is moved by looking at data inside service providers. Not much there on natural capital. The problem is nature is invisible in transactions. The costs of transaction are very high for investors and banks. When you're trying to do the right thing for nature, there are a lot of checks and balances that you have to put in place. That makes it expensive for these transactions, and they're not so profitable. So doing the right thing often costs more than doing the wrong thing. Well, that's a crazy world, isn't it? So let's get into some of these topics. And I'm going to turn, first of all, to Fiona. Fiona, you worked for a gigantic World Bank, nothing less. It's all there in the name. What do you think is the biggest thing that the World Bank do to try and help create this ecosystem for nature?
Thanks, Andrew. And first of all, can I say I love the book, by the way, so I'm going to be one of your main marketers. I think it's great. I really like the structure and the data that's in there, so I'm a big fan of the little book already. I think as the bank, as you say, we are a bank. So I think one of the key things, obviously, is how we use the capital that we have most effectively. And I think this is particularly important for nature versus climate. With climate, renewable energy, you need subsidies to make that business model competitive with fossil fuels, and then the subsidies can come out, it can go on its own. With nature, a lot of the projects and the areas, it may not be by its very nature, commercially viable. So how you use concessional finance, how we use the public sector finance, I think is particularly important for this area. So, and I think to date, we haven't necessarily used the leverage that we can get from the blended finance model of public and private together as well as we could. I think that's the bank. I think the book is honest about that, and I think that's right. So how we leverage better the use of the finance from the World Bank and other the MDBs, as Remy pointed out, is very important. Philippe, I actually really like the Renewable Fund model, for example, where you have anchor investors And then you structure like a project finance 101 with different tranches. I actually like the Renova structure of your funds a lot. I think there's that sort of model, I think, can be very good for, for really getting more of the leverage up. So we act as a bank and we act as a catalyst. John mentioned the word catalyst. The catalytic funding is incredibly important. The other thing I will also pick up, again, it's come up again in the poll, is very interesting on the subsidies. So the other thing we do at the bank, obviously, is in our own operations and our own lending to governments related to policy and using that as a catalyst and leverage for policy change. So I think we have a big role there to play a part in changing how these subsidies are structured in countries. We've done some work with governments in Latin America, for example, around agricultural subsidies. But I think that policy catalytic work that we can use through our lending, but also acting as anchor investors in private finance, I think is two very, very key roles of the bank and the other MBBs can play.
Fiona, thank you very much for that, those opening remarks. Let me turn to Daniela. We've talked about subsidies. I don't know how big subsidies are in Mexico and whether you dealt with that at all in the regulatory work. But tell us what you think from Mexico's perspective and from the perspective of a regulator that you worked with, what they can do to create this kind of ecosystem for finance for nature.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and good morning, everybody. And thank you so much for this invitation. It is a great pleasure to be part of this event. And also thank you, Andrew, for this question. I would like to start highlighting that governments, international leaders, institutions, and initiatives have recognized the importance of looking beyond carbon climate. And we are now working with nature and biodiversity, and it is a big step. Secondly, we have reconfirmed that the private and the financial sector have an important role to play, not only to finance actions related to climate change and biodiversity, but also in understanding their dependencies and impacts on nature. And this decade is to act in consequence. Third point is that the ministries of finance, central banks, financial system regulators around the world are involved in these discussions and are taking action now. So with this context, Biofin Mexico is working with the CNBV to catalyze this positive financial ecosystem for nature. And the CNBV, for all the participants, is the regulatory body that supervises and regulates financial entities here in Mexico. So the work with them would have an effect in the whole financial system, is the reason why we are working with them. And as part of this collaboration, we have analyzed a big set of options and opportunities to generate a positive financial ecosystem through financial regulation. And I can mention some examples, Andrew, to answer your question. The first one is that regulators can help to develop and provide metrics and methodologies to assess how financial entities impact biodiversity, because actually they don't understand that. It's a very new topic, so it is very important. It can help businesses to become more nature-friendly, and decision makers could take environmental issues into account in their decisions. The second issue is the establishment of common definitions of what is biodiversity finance, what is a sustainable investment, or what would be recognized as a green loan or green investment, for example, and adopt it at national level and use these kind of terms in a common way. Third, the regulation can also help to harmonize the different methodologies that we have for providing ESG information and ratings and make it mandatory, particularly in this context where there's a growing interest in combining economic development with sustainability. And finally, the regulation can incentivize and promote nature-positive investments and lending opportunities and financial instruments to mobilize bigger amounts for climate and biodiversity financing. And it is because a better understanding of nature, harmonization of criteria and methodologies allow to investors to measure the impact of their investments and provide them certainty and transparency. So, having said that, Biofin Mexico is working with the CNBV in these 4 points and some other actions for integrating biodiversity criteria in the regulatory system. And I have to say that the CNBV has established sustainable finance within the regulatory agenda for the financial system here in Mexico, and it is a backbone of all these actions taken. And in addition, Biofin is advising the CNBV in its role as a member of the TNFD, which, as you know and you have heard during this One Planet Summit, is working on disclosure, tracking, and reporting of biodiversity finance and nature-related risk. So we are also, finally, in the resource mobilization side. We are sharing some experiences with the Commission and its members, such as the private banks, regarding sustainable financial products focused on conservation, which can have reasonable risk-return profiles and positive co-benefits. So,
Daniela, I'm going to need to move over to Marissa. It's quite a long list there of very, very interesting topics. Will you forgive me? And we'll come back to this in a second, but I need to get, in the interest of time, just let me go across to Marissa, because you've heard what a regulator is looking at in Mexico. I don't know if Credit Suisse does a lot of investing in Mexico, but you invest a lot elsewhere, Credit Suisse. So what's the thing you think is important as a major international bank in this sector? And perhaps reflect a little bit on the regulatory side of this.
Sure, with pleasure. And interestingly, Danielle and I are very much aligned, as we are with Fiona's comments as well. So the beautiful thing about operating in this space is I think we're, in many cases, we cross in parallel circles, but we're all part of the same mission and the same belief system. But if I were to articulate it from the perspective of both a bank using its own lending capital and underwriting capital, but also speaking for the investment community, because every day we're investing with those or interacting with those who have capital that want to deploy capital in these spaces. So first and foremost, picking up on what Daniela said, is a common set of metrics. But in my opinion, for biodiversity, this is where it gets a bit complicated. We need a common set of metrics by industry that are really backed by high quality science. And in that respect, I think we need a simplicity of disclosure, and those metrics do have to be simple. So if we think about a loan that we might be providing to one of our companies, one of the reasons that the environment thus far has been effective in terms of its scaling on CO2 emissions is that's one single number that was globally market adopted as something to strive for. So if you're a company, you can measure your CO2 footprint and try to drive for reduction. Somewhat simple in concept, at least, maybe not in practice. But in the fragile ecosystems, it is not clear that there is one thing to solve for if you are a corporate company trying to drive outcomes. And I think it's very much dependent on the industry. If you're, say, in agriculture, maybe nitrogen runoff is the second thing that you need to be measuring and driving for. So I think we need to come up with something simple by industry, and we need to have that be then commonly adopted so that we can drive scale capital, drive lending capital that way. And I think the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosure, is working very hard at trying to define what those metrics are. And then the whole financial community, as well as regulators and NGOs, can all kind of push in that direction. The second thing I think that we need is a supportive disclosure environment. So option one would be voluntary. And then you work with, I would say, peer pressure to push you into what is best practice. And I have to say that the investment community has an enormous weight and power. You as an investor can drive the outcomes that you want by putting pressure on companies in terms of who you invest in and what you want to see. But you can also do that in the form of being consumers for those companies. And organizations like PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, or even SASB, who are today voluntary, but pushing in a common direction in terms of disclosure and what good looks like, is important. And of course, then the option two is what Daniela referenced, which is mandatory. So having regulators come in and force the issue, because that would jumpstart mass adoption in the financial services industries, because if we have to do it, we don't have a choice but then to move forward. And TCFD, Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure, which today is voluntary, is soon to become mandatory. And that's a very good example on the climate side that hopefully we can adopt through TNFD in due course. And the next thing I would just point to really quickly is just good proof points. We've got to have good case studies that demonstrate to the investment community that the returns are there. And why is ESG investment scaling right now? Because we have more and more proof points, particularly through the COVID crisis, of ESG and sustainable funds outperforming virtually almost, in totality versus their peer benchmarks. So if we can demonstrate those proof points, that gives confidence to the market and more capital will flow. And then last thing would be just different types of investments there has to be a plethora of investment opportunities that can deal with the unique needs of different investors. So there's a pocket for illiquid venture, high risk, high return, but that's not where a lot of mainstream finance is, which is looking for more liquid solutions that they can trade in and out of. That's where a lot of scale capital is. And as the investment community, we need to respond to that to give investment opportunities across the piece. So in that respect, we're trying to give a visibility and voice and a platform for those who we think are doing it well. Andrew, thank you for mentioning the Conservation Conference. I'd like to extend an invitation to this audience. It is free to join, and because we're virtual this year, it'll be on the 21st of January at 2 p.m. British time, and we can make connections for those of you who are interested. But I call this a conference of doers, not talkers.
Okay. Let's get the link to that conference put in the chat. Can somebody find it who's listening and try and get it into the chat so people can find out how to join? A very interesting perspective from Credit Suisse. Now, Philippe, you have been working at the front line of this for a long time, where the rubber hits the road, deploying private capital into some of the most risky environments, as some people may see it, in trying to turn around deforestation in natural capital, but also in other areas, in renewable energy and so on. So we're seeing massive rise in ESG. That's good, but we also need case studies, as Marissa said, of where investment can work. So what's your perspective from working with Mirova and delivering a proof point that investment can really work in this area?
Thank you, Andrew. Very nice to be here with you. Yeah, and, you know, on the climate side, today we have a clear understanding of the relationship between performance and responsibility, I would say, and investment in transition. Everybody understands that investing in renewable energy, clean mobility, innovation, and so on is a very strong opportunity, also in terms of financial performance. We have to prove that it's the same for biodiversity and nature, and to explain that biodiversity is, to a certain extent, a risk for companies, and especially companies who are not taking it into account. But it's also a very good opportunity for investments for private finance, and it's exactly what we are seeing. I mean, we have been building the pipeline for our funds for the last 5-6 years, and we see more and more very good projects and really committed and ambitious entrepreneurs, which are creating new models, developing new markets, especially using technology or gathering a lot of different small farmers without grabbing land and just providing them with services and technology. So there are a lot of very good opportunities on the ground. So that's the first very important thing. But of course, we need to define more precisely what does it mean. I mean, what does investing in natural capital means? We should have a clearer vision, I think, of all the possible investment strategies that needs to be developed on this space. And this is the reason why we think that we have to work with the couple of new players in this area, and this is why we have decided to work with other partners under the aegis of Prince Charles to improve this narrative for institutional investors, and especially with HSBC and Lombardier, what we announced on Monday. You mentioned renewable energies. That's a good point. I mean, because we can make and find the similarities between what we have done in renewable energy and what we do in natural capital. As for renewable energies, we need to accompany the transition from the niche, which was the case 15 years ago for renewable energy, to the mainstream. And for this, we had, for renewable energy, the help of a structure like feed-in tariffs. For biodiversity, we may also have some similar mechanism like carbon credits or biodiversity credits. But on the top of this, clearly, the most important thing maybe today is blended finance. It's very, very important, and you mentioned it. And Remy, you said in his introduction that 80% of the investments today were coming from the public side. So we need to change this. But blended finance has today a track record, but it's clearly a way far from what we can do. We need to build now much more trust and reliability between the public side and the private side. So from the private side, that needs more reliability in terms of the use of ENS, environmental and social criteria. From the public side, that means, quicker decision, more efficiency, and more trust that the private sector can also bring a lot of value in it. So that's I think we of course need to protect ourselves from greenwashing, and we need to put a lot of integrity in this area with also indicators and more reliable measurement tools. And this is the reason why also we launched last year this consortium with other players like BNP Paribas, AXA, and Sycomore in order to create an investment database of the impact of corporates on nature and biodiversity. And hopefully it will be also something that will go out from the TNFD work.
Thank you, Philippe. Let me just open out our discussion. A lot of points kicking around here. We've also had a few questions coming in, and I just want to pick up on one of those questions. One of the questions that's been posed is, how come all the financiers, they only seem interested in financing really big projects? What about small projects? I don't know how you define big and small. I hear the reverse sometimes. A big project, if you're a pension fund, is $1 billion. And there are not enough of those around. They want $1 billion projects. If you're working an impact investor, it might be 20 million, 50 million. But if you're a poor family working on the front line, it might be as little as a few $100s to $10,000. So how do we deal with that spectrum? Fiona, you must have some experience with this with the bank, and then Marissa, you might have a comment on that. Fiona.
Yeah, so certainly I think these putting together these fund structures, I think, is very important. So the more that you can aggregate projects is absolutely key. That's the way you will be able to mainstream, as Marissa, as you're saying, then to get into the broad investor, the scalable group. It's got to be that, and that's what the PE markets, etc., that have learned from this. So we have the structures there. I think it's much more about combining. Whether it's thematically or whether it's regionally, but we have to have more of these fund structures that, as Philippe says, use the blended finance better to really to start to get into the scale of this. So I think it's through fund structures.
Yeah, we might come back to blended finance. Marissa, what is your experience?
Sure, and I agree with Fiona that as an investor, you can either invest in a single entity, a company, a technology. And I think that's probably what our reader or listener was referring to, is it's very hard to get funding for some of these earlier stage investments. And I think they were referencing in particular things in the ocean conservation space. But what we're seeing emerge is that many investors who have a high risk tolerance, they'd like to spread it out over many investments. So this is classic venture capital theory, that you need to have a portfolio of, say, 20 to 50 investments, and a few will hit it big. A vast majority will be middling, and a whole lot will fail. But as an investor, if you can have a portfolio, you buy down your risk. And I think we're seeing very directed funds emerge that are focused very specifically on biodiversity type topics. As an example, there's an organization that just invests in venture stage blue tech. Called See Ahead, not to shout out any one particular organization, but just to illustrate that is a very, very specific way of thinking about venture in a subset of the overall biodiverse space. So I think that's one avenue. And then the second avenue is in the fund construct. Somebody else sort of asked the question of, does it always have to be about returns, financial returns and commercial returns? The answer is, in conservation, this is why it is difficult, is that oftentimes the classic commercial returns aren't there because we haven't been able to figure out a way in a systematic fashion of pricing the cost of inaction, or the pricing the cost of the behaviors that we're deploying. But that's where we can partner with concessionary finance providers. It could be folks like the development funding banks, but it could also be philanthropists in those same structures to take risk off the tables. It could be governments. We had everybody saying that they like this concept of subsidies we often think of subsidies as a specific incentive, but a subsidy can be also in the form of taking risk off the table to enhance returns for commercial investors. Very good example of something like that would be the solar industry. Philippe talked about alternative energy. Through tax equity incentives that were provided back in the day by the US government, that absolutely started the entire solar industry to make it one of the highest employers in the United States, through the mechanism of tax incentives to try to jumpstart something that was otherwise at the time not necessarily fully commercial for the consumer. So I think there are lots and lots of mechanisms if we put our financial innovation brains on.
Well, indeed, and you can find more than 40 mechanisms in the book if you go through them, and there's lots of other case studies as well. So I want to come to Daniela again. Daniela, we had an interesting question from Brian Sobel. How do we make sure financing is going to benefit marginalized populations? Now, I know that, you know, in Mexico, many Latin American countries, there are people struggling on the line there. Maybe you can comment on that. But first, let me ask you about your favorite case study. You work in Biofin. You collected them from all over the world. Do you have a favorite?
Yes, Andrew, thank you so much. And I have some favorite cases, but I choose one that is related with Biofin Mexico's work and is just carrying out in these months. So Mexico shares the same challenges that the people is mentioned here, and with the rest of the world, especially in the LAC region, where public resources for biodiversity are permanently decreasing, but the size of the investments, risk, etc., limits the private and financial sector involvement. So we are working on unlocking resource mobilization for these sources, and let me share you how do we do that. At the end of the last year, Biofin Mexico launched the first specialized bioeconomy acceleration fund, which is providing technical assistance and capacity building for those companies that promote economic activities using components of biodiversity as the main input of value creation. But that also has a net positive impact on livelihoods, communities, and ecosystem functionality under a competitive approach. And as a result of our first call for proposals in September last year, the fund is supporting coffee, honey, mezcal, and aquaculture companies. Our work with them is focused on developing new financial mechanisms for the coffee industry, for example, and expanding sales channels and professionalizing business models, especially in the financial component. So these investment cases will allow to show and disseminate evidence that bioeconomy business models can be consolidated as bankable, profitable, and environmentally sustainable projects, and bridge them with the financial sector as well as multinational companies. So the expected results could be used by the private funds, family offices that have demonstrated interest on conservation investments, but that are not ready to assume the risk associated with this new asset class. So I'm pretty sure that this will be my favorite business case of investing in nature. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Daniela. We had a question from Klaas de Vos on green. Sorry, not the green economy, but the blue economy. We hear a lot about investments on land, but what about investments in oceans? And I know that, Philippe, you've got some experience of that through Mirova in trying to get money to move into the ocean sphere with a sustainable ocean fund and something like that. Can you tell us, you know, and your favorite case study, but how do we get more money moving into the blue economy?
Yeah, sure. So we launched the Sustainable Ocean Fund last year. So we now manage about $113 million on this fund, and we invest in very different kind of businesses. Of course, sustainable fisheries is a basic one, and especially we are focusing on a geographical area, which is the Caribbean, and then we also have very interesting investments in technology, in some technology which helps to catch the fish you want to catch, and to avoid side fishing. We have invested also in businesses around recycling of plastics in the oceans, and also new food for fisheries as well. So there are a lot of new technologies and new entrepreneurs on this side as well. There is also a big issue on about conservation of coastal areas, and there are certainly a lot of very interesting investments to make in ecotourism. Even if, of course, the COVID crisis make it more difficult than it will be without this crisis. So clearly, blue economy and sustainable agriculture are both as well interesting.
Let's just have a final round now, because we're running out of time. But let's just have a look. You know, you're all experts in your field. We've talked a bit about blended finance. You know, if you had a magic wand, what would be the real catalyst that's needed? We heard earlier how long it takes sometimes to get money out of, say, the Green Climate Fund or UN, maybe even the World Bank. The UN system is extremely complicated and bureaucratic, often for good reasons, because there have been problems in the past with money not ending up in the right place. So given we've got this uncomfortable marriage between the private sector that likes to move fast and loose and the public sector that wants to be slow and careful, this is a difficult marriage. How can we accelerate the movement of money to bring these two worlds together and create a giant blended finance fund that could really catalyze action on the ground, but not taking 2 years to make a decision? So, Philippe, a quick thought from you. Quick thoughts, and we'll go right around everyone.
I think we need a kind of a standard of involvement of public entities. I mean, we shouldn't have to make 10 or 15 different files to get money from all the different MDBs in the world and all different governments. So it's a question of really standardizing the relationship between public and private. So I don't know who could take care of this, but that's clearly a good.
And thank you, John. Welcome back to the platform. I'm going to give the last word to you. We're just doing a quick round, so think of what your favorite catalyst would be. So, Fiona, what's your view of the World Bank?
So in terms of catalyst, I actually think also the debt market and the bond markets are going to be incredibly important to really get scale and to really scale up. So we've had the green bonds. John, you mentioned the green bond market, but I also think these performance-linked bonds, I'm actually very excited about them. I think and in the book, actually, you have those as the potential instrument for the most leverage, and I completely agree. If we can start to get, not just from the use of proceeds, but actually changing the cost of capital based on results and actually pushing for the financing of actual results, I think that could be incredibly powerful. We're starting to see it in the corporate bond market. We're looking to see how could you do sovereign bonds linked to NBSAPs or NDCs, where you actually have some financing that pays for this performance. I think that could be actually really catalytical, and it could be a new way of marrying private and public money. So you have an instrument that the private sector knows is fungible in the market. The concessional finance could help to pay for those results. That, I think, could be a game changer and really catalytic.
Excellent. Thank you, Fiona. Marissa, what would be your favorite catalyst?
Well, I will actually reference a project that we're actually working on right now, which is the infamous rhino bond, which is complicated. Animal conservation and preservation is really, really hard. But historical models haven't necessarily worked because they're often based on gala fundraising at a moment in time. Instead of stepping back and taking a holistic look at what animal conservation requires, from community engagement to education to anti-poaching to natural ecosystems for the animals and so on. But in this particular project, it's been hard and complicated and long, but we've had mission-driven partners like the World Bank working with us, the JEF, ZSL, and philanthropists, all in the same structure, saying, you know, this is a common mission. We each bring different skill sets to the table and different capabilities, and we're willing to roll up our sleeves and work together. So I think, in short, it would be giving ourselves the freedom to experiment on difficult subjects and really take the time, because if you can crack the code on one, then you can replicate it many times over and scale it.
So I can't let you go because I want to talk about Beyond Meats, which I know you helped to bring to market. And I went in a Dunkin' Donuts in New York when we could still travel and came out with a Beyond Meats burger. Do you think these kinds of new foods are going to be good for nature? Because, of course, the ingredient in a Beyond Meats burger is soya, and there are problems with the supply chain for soya as well. How do you fix that?
Yeah, you've got to reconcile it, and I think you need to be judicious and look very carefully at the ingredients and where the food comes from. But if you also step back and look at these plant-based alternatives, what they're arguing is relative to their alternatives. So a plant-based burger versus a beef burger uses substantially less water, substantially less land degradation. You don't have the methane from the animals moving into the atmosphere and so on. So on a relative basis, I think you can be comfortable that it's environmentally sound, but that does not say that the input, the supply chain, isn't always necessarily farmed sustainably. So monocrops, we need to make sure that if the input is soy or corn or what have you, that we're thinking about sustainable and regenerative agriculture. But I would also point to really quickly a breakthrough that I think will become commercial probably sometime within the next year or so. And that's cultivated meat and seafood from stem cells of animals and fish. That is profound in that it doesn't use land, it doesn't need much, if any, water. There are no hormones or antibiotics because it's grown in a lab that is as clean as a pharmaceutical lab versus, say, maybe food processing plant. And just in terms of its potential for helping this very challenged planet, it's pretty exciting stuff. So that's a new breakthrough that I would keep an eye on as we move forward.
Well, we're all going to watch as the emphasis moves from fossil fuels to the global food system and how it's got to adapt to stop being the bogeyman of nature, like fossil fuels are the bogeyman of climate. How do we come up with these new foods? Fascinating to hear new technologies, but will they be good for nature? Daniela, what about you? A quick word, only a few words, if you will, on your favorite catalyst, and then I'm going to go to John for the last word and then hand over to Gilles.
Thank you so much. I think that we have to start talking about this kind of investments out of the environmental sector. We have to disseminate these case studies and these successful case investments, but with the investors, with the people that is interested in know and in understand and know how they can be involved in this kind of investments. So I think that talk about it out of the environmental sector is a very good step.
Thank you, Daniela. So John, you get the last word. You've done a wonderful job, and thank you again for being the chief editor on this great project. But you've seen all the catalysts and all the money, and you've worked on a lot of other things. What is your favorite catalyst?
Such a difficult question. Thank you, Andrew. I'm involved in some of these catalysts out there. I'll mention in passing the Coalition for Private Investment in Conservation, for example. But I have to say that if I were to pick one that has the most potential, I would go back to what I was saying at the end of my presentation. And that is a number of pilots amount to nothing more than a number of pilots. So I think this creates an opportunity for a country, a financial center, to say, we are going to build the ecosystem that otherwise could take decades to develop and support it with the kind of know-how that is needed, facilitate the establishment of the service providers that are going to provide the resources and the knowledge for the development of the field. And crucially, from the point of view of the government, the right framework that addresses such difficult questions that we're having to deal with right now, particularly in countries like the US, such as the fact that there are laws that discourage ESG investments and that discourage any consideration of non-financial impacts or benefits in the decision-making of professionals. And until we tackle this holistically, it's going to be difficult. It can happen, but that would be the most powerful way.
Well, everyone, there you have it. You've heard almost an hour and a half of our struggle to find solutions, and the world needs them. We haven't found them all yet, But now I find, having spent 40 years at the front line of this, the mood music is much better than it was. And Gilles, it was probably much better than it was 10 years ago when we launched the first little pink book. Now we've got the 10th anniversary edition. So thank you for giving this platform. Thank you to AFD. Thank you to all those who contributed to it and all the sponsors. And I'm handing over to you, Gilles, to make the final remarks.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, all panelists. Thank you, John. This has really been fascinating. Such a rich debate, both encompassing all the scope of the little book on investing in nature and getting into the nitty-gritties of some key analysis, hypothesis, and solutions, and those updated figures that are so important, because getting global financial data on biodiversity finance is difficult, and it is such a precious result of the collective work around Global Canopy and on this book. I won't try to summarize what was said, but I mean, in a nutshell, for the non-specialists among our audience, but there are many specialists, I guess. I mean, to fill the gap, we need to increase the existing positive by 2 or 3. We need to mobilize private finance to change the proportion with public efforts. But all this will only have an impact if we realign negative incentives, such as those for fossil fuels, intensive agriculture, and fish, and create an enabling ecosystem, including better metrics, better disclosure, regulation or encouragement, and as well a sort of regulatory environment that encourages corporates and finance to actually perform on non-financial issues. All this with better delivery, better coordination, better coherence, especially at national, international levels. And as a, working within a public finance institution, I think the nitty-gritties of blended finance are with impact on biodiversity between the public and the private sector are a key bottleneck at the moment that we really need to widen and to look into. And as Philippe was saying, I think it is absolutely key that we facilitate on both sides this interface and the possibility to go at scale on blended finance. So such rich and coherent propositions altogether with an array of complementary solutions, and all this showing, which I think is one of the key conclusions of your work, that it is possible to bridge the gap, which is indeed good news. And thank you all as well for to the participants for your exchanges and contributions, very rich, to the point. And I think that makes me think that actually we are at a time on biodiversity finance that might encourage us to really invest whatever platforms exist to share Q&A on biodiversity finance, bringing together finance people, regulators, conservation communities to actually move on implementing the recommendations and insights of the little book on biodiversity finance, an idea to think about anyway. Before closing, I just wish to add one more thing. Knowledge, figures, analysis, and sound information is always, a key starting point, but it is not enough for the rapid changes that we need. And I think we really need to take this book and go and change minds and conceptions and perceptions around us. We need to really take the little book to make sure that biodiversity becomes embedded in economics and finance and the activities and mindsets of bankers, of asset managers, of corporates, of public budgets and ministers of finance. And I think we need to approach really through our networks, whether it's at the CBD Secretariat, those involved in impact finance beyond biodiversity, the network of 450 public development banks, the network of central banks, the GEF and all its networks, the G20, the G77, all need to be proactively engaged with the little book's figures and mindset. And I think we really need to do this outreach. The little book on investing in nature really needs to be our Bible until COP15. And I would like to encourage each of us today, we are more than 500 online together, to really pledge that before COP15, we, each of us, go and convince maybe at least 10 persons around us, especially in the finance world, and especially people that know nothing of biodiversity, and convince them about the positive and realistic options that are included in the little book that we launched today, so that everybody understands that investing in nature, converting our economy into a nature-positive economy and finance, to reverse the dramatic loss in biodiversity, and to reconcile humanity and our economy with our planet is possible. So I think this is really, really an important task, and I beg you to go and do this advocacy as much as possible in the circles that are not yet convinced or informed about this. You can see on the slide the site where you can download the copy of the little book, so do use it freely. So thank you again to all. Thank you, Andrew and John. Thank you to all the panelists for this very rich discussion around the launch of the little book. And long live the little pink book in its new version. And I am sure it will be tremendously impactful and useful for the year 2021 and its biodiversity global agenda. Thank you again, and see you soon.
Thank you.